Look, I am so incredibly excited to guide you through today's topic because it completely flips the script on a piece of history we all thought was totally settled. If you were to ask literally anyone, like even a 10-year-old, what took down the biggest, most famous ship in history, they'll tell you exactly how the story goes, right? The legendary, unsinkable Titanic meets a giant iceberg in the North Atlantic, and well, the rest is history. But what if everything we think we know about this infamous shipwreck is incomplete? Today, we are looking at the Titanic story through a lens that is definitely going to leave you questioning the official narrative.
So, what if the Titanic didn't actually hit an iceberg? I know, it sounds absolutely wild, but we're going to explore this incredible firsthand account of a survivor whose story directly contradicts the universally accepted legend. And you know what the craziest part is? His vivid, personal memory of that fateful night has absolutely nothing to do with a mountain of ice. We're going to dig into his personal memoirs, we'll trace his unbelievable journey of survival, and then examine the alternate theories that popped up because of his astonishing claims.
Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1, a different Titanic story. So this whole mystery starts with the personal journey of our main guy here, a 25-year-old Armenian publicist named Vagenak Buryat. He found himself walking onto the decks of the world's most talked-about ship back in the spring of 1912. Vagenek was heading to America to deliver a bunch of books he had co-published with his dad, who was actually a pretty famous Armenian writer. But get this, the trip almost didn't happen. Vagenek had some health issues, and because of that, the consulate initially denied his paperwork. No way he was going. But his dad pulled some serious strings just to get him those papers. Once that was sorted, it was on. He caught the famous Orient Express from Istanbul to Le Havre, made his way over to Southampton, and that's where he found the nearest ship heading for the New World, the Titanic. April 10th, 1912, he was officially on his way. Just picture this guy arriving at the port. He's neatly shaven, smartly dressed, sporting this super trendy cap, and wearing those massive glasses that were just incredibly popular in the US back then. He was totally swept up in the hype surrounding this massive ship, absolutely pumped to take on America and sell his books. He's just so relatable, right? He's just a young professional embarking on the biggest business trip of his entire life. So Vagenek gets placed down in cabin 804. He's sharing the room with two Englishmen and a French guy from Alsace named Morin. Now, because Morin and Vagenek were pretty much the exact same age, and Vagenek actually spoke excellent French, they hit it off right away. They spent their days just blissfully hanging out on the deck, lounging around the onboard saloon, grabbing drinks at the bar, reading in the library. Just young guys having the absolute time of their lives. And obviously not a single one of them could have possibly imagined what was about to happen to this so-called unsinkable ship just a few days later. Moving right along to Section 2, the Midnight Explosion. Fast forward to the night of April 14th. The guys had spent another awesome evening together and went to bed pretty late, just like every other night of the trip. The ship was super calm. But then, shortly after midnight, something absolutely terrifying woke everyone in cabin 804. Bam! A massive, deafening sound. Vagenek didn't describe it as a scrape against ice, he described it as a big explosion. Instantly, it was just total chaos. The nightlights went pitch black. This sudden, violent push literally jolted the two Englishmen right out of their bunks. The impact was so hard that one of them injured his head and the other messed up his arm. Vagenek and Morin scrambled in the dark to help their new friends up. The panic in that room must have been completely suffocating. They rushed out of cabin 804, having no idea they would literally never see it again. The stakes were life or death. Vagenek only grabbed two things, his passport and all the cash he had to his name. $54. That was it. When they got out into the corridor, it was weirdly quiet. The crew members were completely silent, refusing to say a single word about what was happening. But within minutes, the grim reality set in. The ship was sinking. Sailors started prepping the lifeboats, and the order was strict. Women and kids only. Panic spread like wildfire. When a few men tried to sneak their way onto the boats anyway, actual gunshots were fired up into the air to force them back. Which brings us to Section 3, surviving the freezing ocean. The situation was beyond desperate at this point. The Titanic's massive bow was already dipping beneath the surface. Vagenak and Morin just looked at each other, knowing they had to make an impossible choice: stay on a sinking ship or jump into the pitch-black ocean. Both were strong swimmers, and they definitely wanted to live. First, Morin miraculously manages to get his hands on two life vests. Next, Vagenak takes his passport and that $54, stuffs them in a little bag, and ties it tight around his neck. Then came the terrifying part, jumping off the ship into the dark, open water, fully knowing that nobody was coming to save them right away. But the absolute second they hit the water, disaster.
A massive sudden wave crashes over them and they are instantly separated. Surviving this with a friend is one thing, but doing it completely alone in the freezing dark, that is an unimaginable nightmare.
So, the crucial point here is the water temperature. The North Atlantic that night was a paralyzing 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That is below freezing. The second Vaganac hit that water, his arms and legs went completely numb. He was losing strength by the second. And to make a horrible situation even worse, somehow he lost his life vest. Without the vest, and with his limbs basically shutting down from the cold, his absolute only hope was finding a lifeboat before he sank. Just as he was literally about to pass out from the freezing cold, he bumped into something solid, a lifeboat. But look, this isn't a movie, and there was no magical happy ending waiting for him there. The boat was already dangerously overcrowded. He begged for help, trying to cling to the side, but the people inside actually pushed him away with a paddle. They flat out denied him mercy. And their logic, as brutal as it sounds, was survival. One extra man's weight could have swamped that boat, dooming every single person on board. Completely out of strength, Vaganac had to let go, and he eventually passed out right there in the freezing ocean.
And yet, against all odds, a miracle happened. Vaganac actually woke up alive. He opened his eyes and found himself on board the rescue ship, the Carpathia, which was heading to New York with the surviving passengers. He was in really rough shape, though. Terrible headache, double vision. He couldn't remember a single detail about how he was pulled from the water. And that little bag he tied around his neck, totally gone. His passport and his money were lost to the ocean during the rescue.
It actually took 12 days to solve the mystery of his rescue. Vaganac was recovering in a New York hospital when a 50-something woman walked into his room, tears in her eyes, and said, "Oh, my dear boy." It was Mrs. Astor. She had tragically lost her own husband on the Titanic, but she was the one who saved Vaganac. When sailors dragged his unconscious body near her lifeboat, she told him a heroic lie. She claimed this young man was her son and absolutely demanded they pull him in. Not only did she save his life, but it turns out she had actually found that little bag and kept his passport and money safe for him the whole time. Okay, let's wrap this up with Section 4, Fire or Torpedo. It is just a staggering survival story, right? But here is the massive anomaly in the historical record. Vaganac went on to live a long, happy life in Boston, and fun fact, his books even arrived safely on another ship. He was a natural storyteller, and he recounted the tragedy of that night so many times over the years. But here's the kicker. He never, ever mentioned an iceberg. Not once. He only ever talked about a massive explosion. So if his memory is accurate, what caused it? Well, this anomaly fuels two big alternative theories. First up is the coal fire theory. A lot of folks believe a coal fire was raging deep inside the ship's hull long before they even left port, and it just couldn't be put out. People point to departure photos that show a huge dark smudge on the hull, suggesting the fire weakened the metal so much that it couldn't take any kind of impact. Now, to be fair, this theory doesn't necessarily rule out the iceberg. It just means a fire-induced explosion is what actually doomed the ship. The second theory? The German U-boat theory. Vaganac wasn't the only one who reported hearing an explosion from deep below. Plus, some survivors claimed they saw mysterious searchlights from a ship in the distance that wasn't coming to help. Could a submarine have surfaced to inspect its target?
And this brilliantly illustrates why we really have to look critically at the historical context, because that U-boat theory basically falls apart when you check the facts. First off, 1912 was a time of peace. There was zero motive for any country to randomly sink a passenger ship and risk starting a war. Second, the naval technology back then meant a European U-boat literally couldn't travel that far across the Atlantic, let alone hang out there waiting. And finally, hitting a fast-moving ship in the pitch black of night, that's hard enough for modern submarines. In 1912, it was basically impossible. So, while we can't ignore the fact that survivors heard an explosion, a torpedo attack just doesn't align with historical reality. You know, memory is a really complex thing, especially when you're dealing with that level of horrific trauma. We might never know for sure why a man who survived such a freezing, chaotic nightmare remembered a booming explosion instead of the famous scrape of an iceberg. Was there an internal blast that survivors felt? Did the sheer terror of the event warp their perceptions? It's like a giant puzzle, and it leaves us with this incredible historical mystery. So when you weigh the official iceberg narrative against these really vivid first-hand accounts of a midnight blast, do you believe an explosion might have been the real reason the Titanic sank?